In the previous entries in this series, we've watched internet apologist James Patrick Holding's version of the Elisha and the bears story found in 2 Kings collapse with a more thorough examination of the text, a better familiarity with the world of the ancient Near East, and an abandonment of imagination in favor of rationality. In this segment, we will examine another of Holding's fanciful creations, his clownish apologetic regarding the bears of the Elisha story. Recall that in the story of Elisha, found in 2 Kings, the prophet utters a curse on the boys of Bethel in the name of his God, as they mocked him for his baldness. Immediately following the curse, 2 she-bears appear and maul 42 of the children. Holding, of course, has falsely argued that the boys were in fact low-class vagrant wanderers, and in his original video examining the Elisha story, he asserted that the mob of 42 hooligans would have made short work of the beasts, as ancient Near Eastern thugs often looked upon wild animals as sources of clothing, tools, and food. I countered his position by pointing out no such suggestion is made in the biblical text that the 42 gathered up weaponry to attack the bears, and poked fun at his claim that such an attack was motivated by the gang's desire to raise their personal honor ranking. I pointed out that if the bears were sent by God at the request of his prophet Elisha, as the biblical text clearly suggests, then it wouldn't have mattered if bears or German shepherds had leapt from the bushes to attack the children. If God can part the Red Sea, carry people to heaven on fiery chariots, raise folks from the dead, and create an entire universe in 6 days, then he can surely provide bears which will dispatch a crowd of 42 youngsters without much effort. Holding tries to take me to task over my observations by first handing me over to another of his wild cartoon creations, a female furry associate, who tries to contrast German shepherds with Syrian brown bears and American grizzlies, stating there is a real difference in each creature's size, speed, and strength. But when and where did I state there wasn't a difference? Holdings merely created a straw man argument and got his lady friend to go out and beat up on it. Certainly there are differences between these animals, but when they come at God's command, such differences would vanish, I suspect. Donkeys can't talk either, but when they need to do so for God in the biblical book of fairy tales, they seem to have no problem getting the job done. Besides, let's do what Holding and his girlfriend failed to do, and look at these bears within their biblical context. Bears are mentioned frequently in the Hebrew scriptures, often paired with the lion, as examples of great strength and power. The bear, like the lion, is feared. For example, Proverbs 28:15 reads, "As a roaring lion and a raging bear, so is the wicked ruler over the poor people." The critical commentary notes, so Holding's continuous attempts to downplay the size of the bears and thus their ability to do damage to 42 youngsters in the Elisha story by comparing them to American grizzlies is just so much distraction. The bear was obviously ferocious enough to be mentioned in the biblical text as a creature the people of Israel greatly feared, and thus it was an obvious choice by the author of 2 Kings, within the biblical and cultural context of ancient Israel, to be the harbinger of God's judgment on the disrespectful boys from Bethel. Nonetheless, Holding goes on under his delusion that these boys were not youngsters, but hardened, vagrant criminals who had already displayed no fear of Elisha, a prophet of Yahweh with divine powers at his disposal, so they certainly wouldn't have feared a couple of diminutive she-bears, which is why they turned on the beasts with rocks and cudgels in order to get their bones with which to make soup. This is another reason why Holding ignores all the evidence which defines Katan Ne'er as little boys, and needs to grow the youngsters into street-hardened criminals, capable of attacking wild beasts. Perhaps seeing a problem with the bears responding to a divine curse, regardless of the boys' ages, however, Holding tries to distance the creatures from God by implying the bears did not come at the request of Elisha's curse. He seems to recognize that if they had, the blood of the children would be on Yahweh's hands. Therefore, for Holding, the bears are merely a coincidental accident, which occurred while Elisha just happened to be in the neighborhood. The only supernatural activity here is that Elisha used his powers as a prophet to foresee psychically that the bear attack was imminent. In other words, the bears and boys would probably have encountered one another with the ensuing mayhem, even if Elisha and his thinning hair had never passed by. The two events, Elisha's stroll past Bethel and the bear attack, appeared to be completely unrelated events in Holding's apologetic. And that is why Holding changes what Elisha uttered from a curse into a prophecy. In this way, Holding changes the meaning of what Elisha does in the text by simply rewriting it for his own purposes. Now, instead of Elisha cursing the boys of Bethel, he merely utters a prophecy, foreseeing a future event that was inevitable. That would apparently be another apologist trick. If the biblical text doesn't support what you're arguing, rewrite it until it does. Holding states that elsewhere, when animals are sent as instruments of God's judgment, the text clearly states this is so. Apparently, Holding has a severe problem with consistency, because he tried to chastise me for pointing out a similar observation regarding Elisha and his baldness. Recall, I demonstrated that when a person is bald due to mourning, the biblical text clearly states this is so. This link is missing from Holding's apologetic when he tried to argue the reason for Elisha's baldness was because he was in mourning over the departure of his master Elijah, even though the text never explicitly states this. Nonetheless, he now tries to use the same observation to remove divine association from the bears. Because the text does not directly state that the bears were sent as divine judgment, then in Holding's estimation they weren't, and he rewrites the text in order to further support his argument. But my reasoning goes beyond the fact that the text does not give a reason to associate Elisha's baldness with a deliberately shaving of his own head. There also is absolutely no mention in the biblical text, no custom that can be referred to, of someone shaving their head over the mere departure of someone they cared about, or who was a mentor or a master. There are a number of instances, however, of animals doing the bidding of Yahweh, or in some manner being influenced supernaturally. The bears of the Elisha story are certainly not breaking any new ground. However, using Holding's own tactics, let's look at the most logical reason for the bears' appearance. Recall that in principle, I have no problem with the logic Holding is advocating. Indeed, I would have been more than willing to throw my support behind his argument for Elisha's baldness as a sign of mourning over the departure of his master as the most logical, except for the fact that there is compelling evidence to conclude otherwise. So, there certainly is nothing wrong with looking for the most logical reason for a biblical mystery, as long as we don't uncover evidence to the contrary. But remember, the most logical reason isn't always going to be the most rational, if we're trying to remain in the context of a literary narrative. For example, the most logical reason for why Stephen King's car, Christine, went on a vengeful rampage lies within the narrative he penned as the book's author. We needn't conclude that the car had mechanical problems when the narrative itself clearly leads us to conclude that the car was possessed by an evil spirit. We must maintain the integrity of the text and seek what the author likely intended, not what we would want the author to have intended for our own apologetic purposes. With that in mind, the story of the bears in 2 Kings has the animals appearing immediately following Elisha's curse. It was not a premonition, it was not a prophecy. The curse was uttered in the name of the Lord, which is used in the story as an invocation of God's power. This is paralleled and reflected in the already discussed story of Naaman, who, in 2 Kings 5:11, believed that Elisha would heal his leprosy by coming out to him personally and calling in the name of his God. The belief then was that if the prophet spoke in the name of Yahweh, they would get what they were asking for. And in 2 Kings 2:24, when Elisha really does utter a curse in the name of the Lord, what he gets are the 2 she-bears. Logically speaking then, the bears were indeed sent as instruments of God's judgment at the request of Elisha, who spoke this curse in the name of the Lord. To argue otherwise is to divorce oneself from the clear context of the narrative. The curse is given in a divine name, in the name of Yahweh, a name believed to carry great power. Throwing around the name of Yahweh was not something done lightly. Commentators across the spectrum agree that the bears came as instruments of divine judgment. To example just 2 of the most conservative commentaries produced by the evangelical publishers out of Grand Rapids, Michigan, ground zero for such conservative publishing houses, which agree with this reading. Leithart in the Brazos Theological Commentary on the Bible from Brazos Press, a division of Baker Publishing Group, notes, Elisha demonstrates that he bears the spirit of Elijah, which is the spirit of Yahweh, for he can call out bears from the forest as readily as Elijah can call out fire from heaven to consume the soldiers of Ahaziah, as readily as Yahweh can unleash lions against disobedient prophets. Conkle notes in the NIV application commentary published by Zondervan that the bear mauling is divine judgment for culpable denial of divine purpose. The bears are no less divinely appointed than the whale that swallowed Jonah. Clearly, for even these most conservative commentators and everyone else reading the text without a specific apologetic agenda in mind, the arrival of the bears following Elisha's curse is no mere coincidence, but it is expressly linked to the curse as a demonstration of divine judgment. I know it seems extremely odd for a skeptic to be arguing so strongly for the miraculous nature of these stories, and Holding even tries to take me to task for doing so. He points out that even I don't believe in supernatural explanations, so why suggest one here for the arrival of the bears? Well, of course I don't personally believe in the supernatural. I no more believe in the historicity of 2 she-bears coming out of the woods and mauling 42 children at the behest of a religious prophet than I do that this same prophet cleansed a water well or parted the Jordan River or that a dead man rose from his grave. But I'm not trying to argue for the historicity of the Elisha story. I'm simply taking the story within its own context and contrasting it against the apologetic imagination of a misguided apologist. However, Holding himself states in his video that Elisha had divine powers at his disposal. He had the power to purify water, as he did in Jericho right before the Bethel encounter, and he used this divine touch to part the waters of the Jordan immediately following the miraculous ascension of his master Elijah. Indeed, the stories surrounding Elisha's adventures in 2 Kings are overflowing with miracles. Why would the bears suddenly be an exception? It certainly is no stretch to retain this context and understand that the bears fit in with this similar theme. Remember, however, I believe the story is a fiction, and in fiction, anything is possible. I don't think the bears actually mauled 42 children. That's just what the text says. Now, how the mauling occurred seems rather incidental. It is Holding who is trying to defend this tale, not me. In fact, I find myself, as the skeptic, defending the integrity of the original context of this biblical tale from an apologist who wants to rewrite it. The text clearly states that Elisha called in the name of the Lord a curse upon the children, and in the very next line the bears instantly arrive. Clearly the animals showed up as a response to Elisha's curse. Their arrival was not merely coincidental. Elisha was not simply reading tea leaves. It is the logical conclusion to reach, if retaining the contextual integrity of the narrative. I would argue the same thing if anyone were to point out that the story of Elisha and the floating axe head, narrated in 2 Kings 6, never explicitly states that the miracle was supernatural in origin, and thus the floating axe head and Elisha's presence are purely coincidental. While it is true that the narrative merely speaks of Elisha going over to where the axe head fell into the Jordan River and dropping a stick in over it, not uttering a word to his God, in the context of the narrative it isn't a leap to conclude that the rising axe head is supernaturally linked to Elisha's actions, again in the context of the narrative, and that God had a great deal to do with the miracle. Who else in monotheism can float an axe head? Now some, largely apologists, will try to explain the miracle by ironically not crediting their God, but by explaining the axe head may have been composed of a material more likely to float, or that Elisha merely fished the axe head out of the river with the stick he had, or any number of other possibilities. But again, that clearly isn't the intent of the narrative itself. The story in 2 Kings 6 isn't describing a coincidence that occurred alongside the presence of Yahweh's prophet, an event that would have transpired with or without Elijah having been present, but a story directly related to the prophet's importance and power. Perhaps Holding would also argue that no miracle occurred, that God had nothing to do with the Moabite man who had died and was being buried in the same place in which rested Elisha's bones after he himself had died. When the dead man brushed up against the prophet's bones as others were laying him to rest, according to 2 Kings 13:21, the dead man stood up and was alive again. Apparently, an apologist can conclude that no miracle occurred here either because there is no mention in the text of any connection between the man reviving and any supernatural power in Elisha's bones. The text never explicitly states that God had anything to do with resurrecting this Moabite. Perhaps he was never really dead in the first place and just coincidentally revived when he touched Elisha's bones. Or is it far more likely that the author of the tale indeed wanted his readers to believe that there was a direct connection between the dead Moabite man coming into contact with Elisha's bones, the power of Yahweh still wielded by this enormously important prophet of Israel, even in death, and the man's resurrection? Surely even Holding can agree this wasn't merely a coincidence, even though the text is completely silent about any supernatural connection between Elisha's bones and the Moabite's resurrection. And the same author earlier in 2 Kings isn't simply reporting a bear mauling that occurred to 42 children, which had nothing to do with the curse Elijah put on them moments earlier in the name of his God. Only an apologist with a particular agenda and a complete disrespect for the integrity of the biblical narratives could argue such foolishness. Again, however, let it be clear that I personally don't believe any of these events occurred historically as narrated in the book of 2 Kings. I don't believe an axe head rose to the surface of the Jordan. I don't believe a dead man came alive again simply by touching another dead man's bones. And I don't believe there were 2 she-bears that ripped into 42 children. All I'm saying is these events, in their narrative contexts, clearly were believed to have been directly related to activity performed by Yahweh in the presence of his prophet in order to emphasize that prophet's importance and power to work miracles or curses in the name of this God, even after the prophet had died. He was that important, that powerful in the mind of the author, and these stories stress that belief. But I'd like to examine Holding's objection a bit more before I move on, as I find it a quite interesting one for an apologist to make. He dragged up an objection I'd made elsewhere to reports that the resurrection of Jesus was a miraculous event, by noting I state such an explanation is the least likely of any offered. We would need to eliminate all other potentially natural explanations for the resurrection first, before we ever are able to entertain a supernatural one. Holding feels this same line of argument applies to the Elisha and the bears story as well. The bear attack needn't have been miraculous, but could be explained by natural means. It may be shocking to learn that I agree with him, if we were arguing the historicity of the tale. If we'd both accepted that the bear attack was something that actually occurred, you bet I'd be the last one arguing that the bears had come from God. But we're not arguing the historicity of the account. In fact, the story's historicity isn't even a topic of discussion. I've been examining the Elisha story in the context of its biblical narrative, and if I were examining Jesus' resurrection in a similar context, I'd be making the same argument I'm making now, that the resurrection in the context of the gospel narratives is a miraculous event, an event displaying the power of God, and I'd say anyone was foolish to believe otherwise. But can Holding be as equally consistent? If discussing the historicity of the resurrection, does Holding search for a natural, statistically driven explanation for the event? Does he try to distance the resurrection from the supernatural, as he has done with the bear attack? Or when it comes to these sorts of events which underpin his religious faith, or more importantly, the religious faith of his audience, does his antics shift? Does allowing a supernatural explanation for the resurrection become acceptable for Holding, without eliminating every possible natural explanation? Of course, we all know Holding argues for the miraculous resurrection of Christ. It's his bread and butter. But while he peddles the supernatural explanation for this event, he certainly has not eliminated every natural explanation. It's not possible to do so. I think it's rather obvious Holding struggles mightily with being consistent. And speaking of inconsistency, even Holding has admitted the bears were directly related to Elisha's curse, although I'm sure he doesn't remember doing so. In the description of his Raider of the Lost Lexicon Part 2 video, he states that the Katan Nair are those whom, quote, Elisha sent the bears after. If the arrival of the bears was merely coincidental, if Elisha's curse was merely a psychic flash, why state that Elisha sent the bears after anyone? When building his hastily crafted apologetics, Holding can't remember what he's said from one moment to the next. Operating under this false idea that the bear attack had nothing to do with Elisha's curse, and the bears were not exacting judgment for the disrespect shown to Yahweh's prophet, Holding then stresses that the Hebrew word for tear in 2 Kings, used to tell us what the bears did to the boys, doesn't signify the amount of damage the bears may have done. Now, personally, it doesn't matter to me the amount of damage done, just that 2 she-bears attacked 42 children in the Elisha story, at his request, in the name of the Lord, for something as trivial in our day and age as calling him a baldy. As I pointed out in my original video, the damage done by the bears could have ranged anywhere from cuts to dismemberment. If we accept the story for a moment as historical, does it really matter if a certain percentage of the children were only wounded and lived beyond the event to tell the tale? The mauling still came from Yahweh in response to his prophet's curse, in spite of the fact that Holding wants to rewrite the tale to say otherwise. But if we look at how the Hebrew word translated tear in the King James Version, bakah, is used elsewhere by the author of 2 Kings in relation to human bodies, one certainly doesn't come away with an image of mere cuts and bruises. For example, in 2 Kings 8:12, the same author composed this tranquil imagery. I know the evil that thou wilt do unto the children of Israel. Their strongholds wilt thou set on fire, and their young men wilt thou slay with the sword, and wilt dash their children, and rip up their women with child. Rip up here is the Hebrew bakah, translated tear in the Elisha and the bears story. And again in 2 Kings 15:16, Then Menahem smote Tipsah, and all that were therein, and the coasts thereof from Tirzah, because they opened not to him. Therefore he smote it, and all the women therein that were with child he ripped up. So when the author of 2 Kings employs bakah in relation to human beings, specifically what occurs to their bodies at the hands of soldiers or bears, the usage is rather clear. The intent appears to be one of literally ripping open the flesh with the intent to cause death. And as I'll discuss in more detail later, the author of the text in all likelihood wanted his readers to understand that the boys of Bethel were killed by Elisha's bears, and not merely wounded in the mayhem, in order to drive a particular point home to his audience. However, to support his argument that the author of 2 Kings did not intend his readers to understand that the bears of his Elisha story would not have literally tore open the boys, as the soldiers tore open pregnant women later in his book, Holding stresses the rarity of human deaths caused by bears in places like Alaska. With this data, Holding can claim that the children of Bethel wouldn't have died in the mayhem unless they drew first blood and attacked the unprovoked bears themselves. Because we all know bears responding to a prophet's curse as harbingers of divine justice would certainly take note of and obey statistics.
You know, Sally, human deaths caused by bear attacks are rare. Holding has the statistics. We need to go easy on these kids so as not to skew the data.
But this whole business with the amount of damage inflicted by the bears highlights another reason why Holding requires the Katan Nair to be low-class vagrant wanderers for his apologetic, issuing them rocks and cudgels for weaponry. With this image in mind, he can have the murderous thugs engage the bears in mortal combat, a situation rendered far less likely were the boys to be younger and merely the children of Bethel. In this way, the bear maulings will be the result of foolish hooligans who attack the hapless bears, just as they attacked the hapless Elisha. Those thugs were just no good, no matter how they were sliced. Holding can continue to deflect criticism of the story away from Elisha and Yahweh, who, in a plain reading of the text, team up together to send she-bears to maul 42 little boys, and instead draw attention to a gang of low-class, violent hooligans, unafraid of Yahweh's prophet, and 2 wee bears with bones, suitable for soup. But before I close out this section on the bears, I want to take exception to a smear attempt Holding tries to make in his video, in which he accuses me of merely laughing at his description of ancient Near Eastern characters attacking bears in order to get their bones for soup. My derision was directed squarely at Holding and his use of this information in defense of the Elisha story, not at the information itself. In my original video, I stated flatly that no doubt there were roaming bands of outlaws in ancient Israel, and surely they occasionally may have happened upon a bear and used its remains for a variety of reasons. My criticism was not on this observation, but was directed solely at Holding, stating quite matter-of-factly that this was the case in the Elisha story. Relying on his erroneous assertions regarding the age of the Bethel children and their profession as vagrant hooligans, he without justification deepens the plot of the Elisha story by having them attack the bears as opportunists. I challenged Holding to not merely assert these details, but to associate them firmly with the biblical text, a challenge which he failed to meet. We are left with nothing but his bare assertions. Again. But when all is said and done, Holding has made a valuable point. It really is pretty silly to suppose 2 bears made mincemeat out of 42 boys, young or old. So to follow Holding's lead and not invoke a miracle or supernatural powers to account for the massacre, what really is the most logical explanation for the story? We now know we cannot appeal to the boys as street-hardened hooligans. That just isn't the meaning of Katan Nair. So without bloodthirsty thugs hungry for bear soup, what do we have left? Holding dismisses the idea that the little boys would have been frozen in fear, and I even think that's a bit far-fetched for a number like 42 if we're going to take the tale seriously. So what really is the most reasonable solution? As if the answer hasn't been staring you in the face already.